All right, I want to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here today for our second session for the Mobilizing Alberta Climate Conversations speaker series. My name is Alana Dawn. I'm the Sustainability Partnerships and Events Coordinator with the Office of Sustainability. We're really honored today for the opportunity to learn from these amazing individuals. I'm really excited for our conversations on just energy transitions. To get started in a good way, I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, the Kainai, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Land acknowledgements are really important to help build respectful relationships in the spirit of reconciliation. And with the context of today, we also acknowledge that reconciliation is a really important act for climate justice and in just energy transitions. So as I mentioned, today is our second keynote session of the Mobilizing Alberta Climate Conversations speaker series. Through this series, we inspired to engage in transformative conversations on climate action. We want to learn from and share diverse perspectives and worldviews on climate action and climate justice to support participants to take meaningful action in their own ways and connect with the climate action community. Before we get started today, I did want to share with you some ethical space guidelines. This is going to be help us to be mindful in our Q&A to help create a respectful space for dialogue. Ethical space guidelines offer a framework for creating space for respectful conversations in a way that upholds each other's integrity and honors the differences so we can have real human-to-human conversations. So even though you've probably noted this is a webinar today and you won't be able to use your own voice to engage in the conversation, you can use the Q&As. So these guidelines will just help us to, in our virtual space today, help create a more ethical space. And this comes from the teachings of Dr. William Ermine. He's a professor with the First Nations University of Canada. And these guidelines today have been adapted from his teachings. So we will welcome, respect, and value everyone's voice. We participate in conversations on equity, anti-racism, and discrimination in good faith. We're open to new learnings, ideas, and ways of thinking and doing. So we're welcoming diverse perspectives on this topic. And I just wanted to note here, I don't think it's going to be an issue today, but just for transparency, if there's any Q&A that seems intentionally harmful or disrespectful, they won't be answered and you'll potentially be removed. So again, I don't think that's going to be an issue, but just in an effort to be transparent. We practice curiosity in these conversations. We practice humility. We uphold each other's integrity and dignity, and we're accountable. So here's our agenda for today. Soon you're going to meet the lovely Sarah. She'll be moderating. She'll introduce our speakers. We'll engage in a panel discussion with the speakers, and then a Q&A with the audience. So you should note that your Q&A function should be either at the top or the bottom of the screen, and there you can put your questions, and I'll kind of keep an eye on them. When we get to that portion of the session, I will share them with the speakers. Okay, so I'm very happy to introduce our moderator. Sarah Stanley is an instructor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. She is a feminist social worker who specializes in community development and has spent a decade working with girls and women leaders in Calgary and across the UK. Part of this work involved learning from young women about their approaches to honoring their anger about injustice and making change on climate and environmental issues. She has recently worked at a clean energy think tank on issues related to gender, equity, and Alberta's energy transition, where she co-authored a report called Equitable Net Zero, Recommendations for Advancing Gender Equity in Alberta's Energy Transition with her brilliant colleagues. She currently works as a violence prevention researcher and curriculum developer with SHIFT, the project to end domestic violence. So I'll pass it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Alana Dawn. And I'll just echo the welcome to our Sharing Diverse Perspectives on Just Energy Transition session. I'm so glad that you could all be here. I want to say, yeah, I guess I said thank you, but thank you again to Alana Don and to the Office of Sustainability for inviting me to moderate this panel of amazing folks. I'm really excited to hear what they have to share with us. And yeah, as Alana Don said, I'm Sarah Winstanley. I work as a sessional instructor and researcher within the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. And while a lot of my work right now focuses on domestic violence prevention, I think there's lots of intersections around energy transitions. And I think a lot about my recent work on gender just energy transition issues, and will always hold a place in my heart for the work and the people who lead it, because I think it's so necessary. So I want to start by introducing our incredible panelists. I'm very excited to learn from them, and I hope you are too. I'm sure that's why you're here. I'll share a little bit about them, and then I will turn it over to them to introduce their work further and share anything else that they think is relevant for us to know before we dive into some deeper conversation. So Dr. Jennifer Winter is an associate professor in the Department of Economics and the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Her research evaluates climate policies and examines the effects of government regulation and policy on energy development and the associated consequences and trade-offs. Her current research projects include carbon pricing costs for households in Canada, comparing provincial emissions reduction policies, and federalism and climate policy. She's testified to the Senate of Canada and the House of Commons on emissions pricing policies based on her work in this area, and she's advised the Government of Alberta, Government of British Columbia, and the federal government in several capacities. Dr. Winter is actively engaged in increasing public understanding of energy and environmental policy issues, and recognition for her efforts include a 2014 Young Women in Energy Award, being named one of Alberta Oil Magazine's top 35 under 35 in 2016, being one of Avenue Magazine's Calgary top 40 under 40 in 2017, and being one of Canada's Clean 50 and Clean 16 in 2019. Dr. Winter serves on the mitigation expert panel at the Canadian Climate Institute, the City of Calgary Climate Panel, the Future Leaders Board of Directors of the World Petroleum Council of Canada, the Board of Directors of the Canadian Society for Evolving Energy, and is also a member of Global Affairs Canada's Environmental Assessment Advisory Group. So welcome to you, Jen. Our next panelist is named Jacob Crane and is a citizen of the Tsuut'ina Nation in Alberta and Canada. He's the Community Engagement Coordinator for Indigenous Climate Action, which is an Indigenous women-led organization dedicated to creating a world with sovereign and thriving Indigenous peoples and cultures, leading climate justice for all. He first joined the climate justice movement in 2015 after hearing about the No Dakota Access Pipeline and the struggles that the Standing Rock Sioux tribe was experiencing by the state. It also brought him back to the Idle No More movements that swept across so-called Canada in 2012. So welcome, Jacob. And finally, Dr. Julie Darlay is a professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary and is the project director of Transforming the Field Education Landscape Partnership. She leads an international social work research program to advance knowledge in the fields of social work and social development. She's an internationally recognized expert in international social work, and her research focuses on field education, disaster social work, social development, and sustainable development, as well as immigrant settlement and integration. Her research excellence has been acknowledged through several awards, including a Killam Research Excellence Award in 2020, the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, and as a member in the College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists of the Royal Society of Canada in 2019. She's a registered social worker with the Alberta College of Social Workers, and Dr. Darlay has lived and worked in many countries, including Eswatini, France, Mexico, Egypt, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, and Malawi, and has conducted research in partnership with scholars in Nigeria, India, and Ethiopia. She teaches courses on international social work research, social work practice with immigrants and refugees, sustainable development, and field education. And welcome to you, Julie. So I'd love to give you all a minute to kind of talk a little bit more about your work as it relates to just energy transitions. So maybe we'll start with you, Jen, and then Jacob, and then Julie can follow you and do the same.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. So my background is as an economist. That's my training, and my thinking about just energy transitions and my research in this area has evolved quite a bit over the time I've been a scholar. And my interest is in this area is really recognizing that we live in a world that is far from first best. And so I think I can bring some interesting nuance thinking about the intuition and the sort of the basics of economic theory and how people and businesses behave under like resource constraints, and try and link that to what we know about like first best efficient policies and the challenges we face in implementing that in a world where there are multiple interactions in terms of levels of government and you know, just the normal frictions of the way we've built society, and the sort of, I would say also that the challenges of our institutional and structural backgrounds. And so I'm really excited to be part of the conversation today and listening to insights from my fellow panelists.
I'll go next. Dadanist Adas is a Jacob Crane. Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Crane. I go by he, him. I am from Tsuut'ina Nation, which is located in Treaty 7 territory, and I am the engagement coordinator with Indigenous Climate Action. I'm new to the engagement coordinator position. Prior to that, I was the Just Transition lead for ICA, and I did that for over a year. And you know, a lot of my background actually is in community building, and I'm pretty sure that's why they wanted me to switch over to engagement, just because you know, I'm really what's the word I'm looking for? Community oriented. I like building community. I like building capacity in those ways, and the grassroots movements, really, I think that's where my strength is, and also grassroots fundraising. So I really enjoy bringing people together, bridging communities, and you know, having conversations around what that just energy transition looks like. And so I think it's really important to recognize, you know, how we involve Indigenous peoples in these movements, just because of the historic background of Canada and the province, you know, excluding Indigenous people in the structures and the frameworks and the mechanisms that the country was built upon. And so it's in the framework, it's in the structures, it's in the mechanisms on how that is exclusive. The language is exclusive to Indigenous people. So my job, I'm assuming in this panel, is to figure out a way, how do we bridge those in a way that ensures that nobody gets left behind, and that we can have this just energy transition together. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm willing to dive in deeper as the questions come and go. So thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name's Julie. I'm a social work professor. I'm located on Treaty 6 territory in the city of Edmonton in the central and northern Alberta region. My understanding of just energy transition has been influenced in recent years through a community-based project led by the Hannah Learning Center and conducted in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Lana Wells, also in the Faculty of Social Work, and community members based in Hannah. And this project aimed to understand with partners around how to mitigate some of the negative social effects of transitioning out of coal, that were some of the community impacts being experienced in the small center of Hannah here in Alberta. And so looking to identify what are some of the community priorities, what are the resources and assets that exist to really think about how to strengthen community resilience. So I'm here to share some of our findings from this project, and also my ongoing work looking at disaster social work and recovery in affected communities from a social work perspective that really looks at some of the social dimensions that emerge, how we can better incorporate environmental and climate justice in our work, and kind of aim to position ourselves in a transformatory way, recognizing that the way we've done things before are not really going to serve us well in addressing tackling some of the challenges that we're now, you know, confronting in many ways at a community level, at a societal level. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing a bit about yourselves. I think it's really interesting it'll be interesting to hear how you kind of layer your different perspectives together. And I want to start us off with 3 questions, and then we'll look at the audience questions to keep the conversation going. But I want to invite the panelists to respond to each other, pose questions if you have them, and just kind of build on what each other's saying, or challenge things, whatever feels relevant for you in terms of how you want to engage. For those in the audience, I think Alana Dawn mentioned this, but please feel free to submit those questions through the Q&A feature as the discussion unfolds. But yeah, so maybe let's get started. Our first question is, what does a just energy transition mean to you and your communities? And I'd love to start with Jacob for this question, and then Jen and Julie, if you want to jump in as makes sense after, that would be great.
Yeah, great question. I think when I think of just transition, I think of reconciliation and transition, which is equity. And so ensuring that we're honoring our treaties, our inherent rights as Indigenous people, being the first people of these lands, and ensuring that we're being included in those spaces, whether it's policy, government, conversations, panels just like this, so that we're not ignoring that part, because that's a really powerful space that we're going into. And so I think that's really what I think of when I think of the just transition. And of course, the equity part is ensuring that we have the funds, the means, the accessibility to the dollars that are being pumped into the so-called Canadian government, that's going to be filtered into Indigenous communities, and making sure that it's not, okay, this is the framework, you have to fit within the Canadian framework to access those funds. But I just said earlier in my conversations that there are grassroots movements and folks that are on the front lines that need to be able to access those dollars as well. So it's being more inclusive, creating more better structures, more inclusive structures and frameworks that are inclusive to all Indigenous people. And so I know that's a lot, that's a heavy lift. I understand that that's going to take some time, but again, looking at it from an Indigenous perspective and from a community perspective, understanding that, like, if I was the province and the government, I would be a little bit more proactive and not like waiting for emergency. Okay, now we have to go in and help. We have to go in and help now because there's an emergency, there's a climate crisis. And so I think that's something that we kind of get a little bit frustrated as Indigenous people, is like the only time we really hear from the provincial government and the federal government is when there's a crisis or there's an emergency, right? And so it's kind of, we got to change that a little bit. And that's some things that I've kind of been, taking part, and I'm just seeing that throughout the pandemic is, yeah, we're still here. Thank you for checking on us during this emergency. And now that there's a climate crisis, well, thank you for checking on us. We have to ensure now that we're being a little bit more inclusive. And so I've seen that right across the board. I have a lot of, what's the word that I'm looking for? A lot of experience in the United States as well with the Native Americans tribes down there. And it's the same thing, it's tomato, often excluded, last ones to get the support, not being listened to in an authentic way. And I guess, I don't know, I was just at the COP27, the Conference of the Parties, part of the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in Egypt this past week. I was there for 2 weeks, and I was sitting in watching a panel, and there was a lot of provincial government officials, federal government officials there that were a part of the environmental space and protected lands. And I thought it was probably one of the most exclusive conversations that I've ever sat in. I started to count the number of times that they would say Indigenous people. One time they said Indigenous people. That is not very inclusive language. And so these are the people that are creating the regulations and all that fun stuff, policy around what this energy just transition, or this just energy transition, is going to look like. And so that's a little worrisome. It's going to be an uphill battle for Indigenous people to really be involved in this movement, and to be able to ensure that we have the resources, to ensure that the resources are accessible, not just for folks that fit into these frameworks, but for the folks that are on the grassroots level. So it's pretty important. And what that looks like from a community perspective, again, is just including folks at all levels, policy creation, including them in panels like this, making sure that they have the proper resources, the capacity to do the work, not just expecting these folks to do it for pro bono. Like that doesn't work like that anymore. You know, we want to make sure that we're creating, you know, jobs and careers as part of this just transition movement, and that we're honoring and respecting our inherent rights and treaty rights as Indigenous people. So I could honestly go on for like a whole another hour, but I don't want to take up too much time. But I think it's super important that we center Indigenous people in this just transition, and that we ensure that folks are leading, Indigenous people are leading these spaces, and that they have a seat at those decision-making tables, and that it's not tokenism. They have a voice there, and that folks are listening. Thank you.
I think I'll jump in, and Jacob, loved your comments. To me, I think one of the issues we face and the challenges and the opportunity inherent in a just transition is that we as society, as Canadians and our governments, we have this opportunity and the challenge of not maintaining the status quo, in that there are inherent inequities in our current systems of government and governance and our energy systems. And for me, the just transition is also about addressing some of these inequities. And to give a concrete example, some of my research is around the issues of energy affordability and energy poverty, and a lot of the challenges there is that the programs that are in place are meant to address acute emergency situations where households are not able to afford their energy bills, and there is not a lot of effort put into proactive prevention of those situations from a policy perspective. And so what I hope for in a just energy transition is that we are able to address these issues of affordability in a proactive way as we transform how we create and how we use energy.
I'd like to add, if that's all right. I think often when we think about just transition, that's been understood by different levels of government, that society should share in the costs of transitioning to a low carbon economy. And so often funds or resources are put into place to support some of the workers who may be transitioning in those affected sectors, sometimes also with the employers or the industry themselves. And with our project with the town of Hanna, we actually found that a just transition approach didn't really go far enough. We need to think about a just community transition, to really think about how we can better integrate some of the social dimensions that are taking place at the community level as these effects are being experienced, and use that as a way to advocate for additional resources, particularly in supporting social services and programs that can help mitigate some of these negative effects. So I see a just community transition as a long-term process that continues to need to be revisited over time. It can't just be a one-time infusion of funds. It needs to look at how communities are experiencing and coping and adapting to these changes over time in a changing context. Because we know, with the COVID-19 pandemic, things have really changed. The circumstances affecting communities have shifted and changed. So how do we engage in planning to also leverage many of the strengths and capacities that exist at the community level? So adopting a strength-based approach, looking at how do we foster community resilience in this context, and building relationships among those at a community level to think about, how do we successfully transition away In the case of Hannah, it's from reliance on coal, but thinking about the importance of those social support resources along with economic development funding that can, further build those relationships, create hope, to adapt to, what the future might look like and strengthen infrastructure and community well-being.
Great, thank you so much. I definitely am struck by what you kind of all echoed in this way of not just looking at things as an emergency and sort of responding after and in a one-time kind of way, but it needs to be ongoing, it needs to be preventative and proactive. So I appreciate that kind of theme being woven throughout, and you've all given some great examples of what that might look like in your communities. And so I think you've kind of spoken to what is a just transition, but now I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more to some of the how we maybe get there in terms of equitable practices and approaches to reconciliation through an energy transition. So this time I'd like to start with Julie, and can you speak to reconciliation and equitable practices or approaches that can support mobilizing just energy transitions? This can be at the individual, I know you spoke to the community level, can be institutional or systemic. And if you want to elaborate further, what are the benefits of just energy transitions and being able to create and envision these healthy, equitable communities, ecosystems, and society? That's a really big question. But if you just want to take a try, and then Jen and Jacob, if you want to jump in as you see fit.
Sure. No, thanks, Sarah. It is a complex question. So let me start by saying what I think some of the approaches are that can help support the mobilization. So I think part of this lies in building relationships, fostering hope, leveraging strengths and capacities, and also considering decolonizing anti-colonial and Indigenous approaches in speaking to reconciliation and equity. We know that climate change is raising many ethical challenges, especially in relation to climate justice. In my field in social work, we are recognizing more and more that social justice is climate justice, and looking to better incorporate environmental justice and sustainability into social work practice. And this is certainly a work in progress. Our social work practice now needs to catch up to our theory in this area in green social work. I also think that environmental justice movements and environmental social movements are confronting a number of diverse issues that are embedded in other social movements. And I think the importance of the rights of Indigenous peoples and thinking about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, this is a minimum standard to be met, and we have a long ways to go in this. And so linked to this as well are some of the interconnected crises that we're experiencing in the world today. We look at impacts of climate change and calls for adaptation, the continued impacts of COVID-19, systemic racism, cost of living crises. There are many of these dimensions that are coming together and kind of changing the risks that we thought we knew about, where new responses are needed. And so this is really calling for some transformative change. And so in my work, I've seen that what we need are holistic and integrated approaches that bring together, what's called a whole of society approach, that it's not just disaster and emergency management that has a role to play in mitigating these risks, but we actually all have a role to play. And so, to tackle these multiple challenges and sometimes multi-hazard events. And so how do we do this? Well, we need to invest in social infrastructure. We need to think about the importance of social services and programs in helping to meet people's needs and really focusing on people in communities. In integrating diverse views, experiences, capacities, and doing so in culturally sensitive and culturally based approaches, strength-based approaches, and co-developing solutions. So I'll stop there and invite others to contribute to this multi-dimensional question.
Maybe I'll just briefly repeat it because it is a very big question. So I've just asked people to speak to reconciliation and equitable practices or approaches that can mobilize just energy transitions. And then what are the benefits of doing some of this work? So I'll just remind, I always forget the question, so I'll just start.
Yeah, I think involving Indigenous communities and nations is a first step in building out infrastructure for that. I know that there are folks that work with the AFN, but I think, you know, there needs to be more of a layer added within that. For folks that don't know what the AFN is, it's the Assembly of First Nation Chiefs. But I think there needs to be a little bit more on a local level and a provincial level, more support mechanisms and systems put into place that are Indigenous, that have Indigenous people operating and creating those solutions, working with nations to come up with those solutions on climate change and how to mitigate that and how to hold that space so that Indigenous knowledge systems are being valued and not just kind of like, well, that's nice. We checked the box, we consulted, let's keep moving on. Let's keep, you know, it has to be a little bit more than that. It has to be a full-on, you know, full-on framework that's Indigenous friendly, that's going to uplift our treaty and inherent rights so that we're being brought along with so-called Canada and the provincial government as they shift over to the just transition and that we're not being left out. So I think that would be one way to do it. Again, I can't, you know, I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous people, but that's one way to do it. There's many ways. But I think the first thing is opening up dialogue with Indigenous people and nations and listening to them and asking them, what do you want to see? And how can we facilitate that? And what support systems and mechanisms do you need from us? Because we're the ones holding the purse. And how did they get the purse? Well, they got it from extracting from Indigenous people's lands, land theft, displacement of Indigenous peoples. And so that's kind of weird. That's a weird conversation to ask people for your money back that was taken from your lands. That's kind of a weird conversation, but also to come in with an open mind and an understanding, and that it's okay to disagree. Like, we're not always going to agree. We're gonna fight with each other in this just transition, but we have to understand that, you know, we have to listen to folks that have been oppressed and have been left historically excluded from. So I think you get a lot of equity. You get a lot of folks being a part of the new economy, building up their economies that were destroyed when colonization happened and colonialism, you know, all that stuff. You get a lot of happy people that are being able to participate. So I think being able to participate is something that is really should be important in this new economy that's going to be coming out of that just transition, right? And so it's election times right now within Tsuut'ina. And one of the conversations is, hey, we want to participate in large scale solar. And we want to be able to plug into the grid here in Calgary. You know, so we definitely want to do business with Calgary. We want to do business with them, but it's like we have to have that support systems to do that. And so we have to definitely act and support ourselves, because at the end of the day, it's really hard to get the provincial and federal government to support that. And so we have to ensure that we're moving by ourselves as well, but there has to be support there. And so anyway, I'll stop there.
So I want to try and bring my own research into this, and sort of the challenges of the type of research that I do, in that so like most recently I've been trying to understand how carbon pricing affects costs for households, and what are different options for government revenue recycling. I'm also doing work understanding sort of the state of energy affordability or energy poverty in Canada, and how costs associated with the energy transition or carbon pricing will affect households at risk of being in energy poverty. And the reason I think that is that's relevant is we rely on, or me and others who do this type of analysis, we rely on like survey data produced by Statistics Canada, and that that data is primarily data from households in southern Canada, major population centers, and is not necessarily representative of remote communities or Indigenous communities or Indigenous reserves. And we have this I would say this data gap, which is perpetuated in part because of past experiences of communities with researchers, where researchers treat communities as subjects rather than partners. And it means that in thinking about the effect of energy transitions on Indigenous communities in particular, I think there is really I would say like a huge gap between our scientific understanding and the lived experiences of communities, and I think that is something that I would love to work towards in improving our understanding and working with both in like Indigenous communities and smaller and remote communities to have analysis that meets their needs and helps them understand the potential effects. And I think this is something that is just, incredibly important, that we probably don't, as academics, we don't put enough effort into building up these relationships and partnerships the way Julie was talking about, to have the help communities figure out what they need and help. I feel like I'm saying this wrong, and it's really like I'm coming from a place of I have knowledge and expertise that I can bring, and I would love to see academia put more effort into community-based partnerships to help communities adjust to what is going to be a challenging transition.
Just spinning off that too, I think like understanding the power privilege dynamics of like having resources, an abundance of resources, and then coming and working with community. Like this is a situation that I had. I put a powwow on. I put a powwow on several weeks ago, and there was this group, this environmental group, that wanted to come and, have a sharing circle and stuff like that. And I said, okay, yeah, you can do that, but you have to participate at the powwow and you have to be a vendor. And they would not do that. I had to fight them to do that. And I just was thinking in the back of my mind, so you want to come to this Indigenous space to basically study us and then extract that knowledge and then run with it and then get funding for it so that you can continue the work. But your entire team is non-Indigenous. This was wrong. And so I called them on it. I had to fight with them. They eventually ended up paying the vendor fee, which was only $300, but it was just ridiculous. I thought that was so interesting. And then I went into the circle. They had a sharing circle, and I kind of disrupted it a little bit and got everybody kind of riled up. But it was important for them to see that they're coming at it from a place of privilege, and that they need to share. They have an abundance of resource. They have to share in those spaces, and they're compensating Indigenous people for their knowledge that has taken them a lifetime to gain. And so sometimes in academia, we uphold, that Western colonial degrees and education systems and mechanisms, but we don't uphold Indigenous value and knowledge systems that have taken a lifetime to learn. And over here, reconnecting to one's culture and traditional ways of life, learning one's language, that is climate justice, that is climate action, because you have a people that used to live without trash, where everything was biodegradable, but we've been forcefully removed and put into a new system that works for some people, but it's causing climate change. It's causing this climate crisis that we're in. And so just being Indigenous and going back to who you are, that is helping. And so anyways, that's a roundabout way of showing that. And I'm a storyteller, so some things won't make sense, but actually I hope that people understand that. So support those community events is what I'm saying. Partner with those nations to, how can I give $10,000 to your powwow? Because I know that this is supporting Indigenous young people to be rooted in their culture, so that they can grow up and they can be, climate justice, advocates, and they can continue to create that wave, right? So anyways, just wanted to share that.
Yes, thank you so much, Jacob, and to Jen and Julie for sharing. I think that theme of kind of building relationships, and I think it just makes me think seem to be at a place in like climate work or environmental work where many folks who aren't Indigenous acknowledge the importance, but then that, I think what you're speaking to, Jacob, is that kind of like how we engage in those relationships can replicate colonial dynamics, can replicate that extraction. So I think that reminder of how to approach that in a different way and really challenge those kind of like colonial mindsets, I think is a really important reminder. So thank you. I feel like there's lots, I feel like I could say a lot, but I'll move on to our third question. And so this third question is about impact. So maybe Jen, I'll ask you to lead us into this one, if that's okay. So can you talk about how specific groups of people will be impacted if just energy transitions are not prioritized in Alberta and Canada? Or in other words, what happens if we just replace our current energy systems or current energy sources without addressing anything else? So again, Jen, if you want to start, and then Julie and Jacob, feel free to jump in when you're ready.
Absolutely. So I think there are two pieces to think about. One is our sort of the transition we're in now and the policies that are in place right now to change behavior. And then the other piece is what our energy system looks like in the future and how individuals interact with it. So I think on the first piece and the sort of the nearer term impacts, in say a perfect world, we have carbon pricing and it incentivizes people to fuel switch and electrify and things like that. But there are, I think, like differences in the pace and who can adapt sooner rather than later. And I'm thinking of like lower income households who don't necessarily have the financial capacity to put in a heat pump in their house, or don't have the ability to switch to a higher efficiency furnace or a more fuel efficient car, or switch to an electric vehicle. And so there is that tension there in the putting policies in place that we want to incentivize decision making that changes how we use energy, and the potential differential impacts or ability to absorb increased costs or change behavior. And that is, I would say, a really messy problem. And it's also an issue because of the different federal and territorial and provincial responsibilities, in that it's provinces that are responsible for the electricity systems, and the federal government is only involved when it crosses interprovincial boundaries and things like that. So there's this differential responsibility that also complicates the picture. And then I think on the sort of the longer term piece is, no one knows what the transition will look like and what 2050 will look like, or 2030 or 2040. And so that makes it also challenging to think about mitigating effects on lower income households or remote communities where like, for example, where there is very limited ability to switch from, say, diesel to electrification. And then that, to me, opens up the question of, do businesses and households in Southern Canada that are connected to grids and things like that, does that mean that we need to do more? Because Canada has this blanket commitment for an energy transition or net zero, but where the changes need to take place and when, I think is still like a really open question, and gets to very, I think, interesting and challenging conversations about the I would say the distribution of effort and the equity of effort needed to change our energy systems.
Maybe I could go next, if that's all right, Sarah. So I'd like to share some of the findings from the project that was led by Hannah Learning Center in looking at some of the community impacts of the coal transition and moving away from reliance on coal-generated electricity in Hannah. And what we found in the research was that a number of community priorities and resources were identified in relation to the anticipated closure of the coal power plant and some of those economic and social impacts on the community. So just to maybe use this as a bit of a case study to highlight like what are some of these issues and who might get left behind as we think about this just transition. One of the most significant social priorities that we found was concerns about retaining the town's population. And this was about approximately 2,500 residents. And people were concerned that if young families and residents move away to seek out new employment and livelihood opportunities outside of the community, this would mean that there would be fewer people living in the town of Hannah, and that this demographic change was perceived to have a potential negative effect on the availability of services and programs in the community. And many of the participants also agreed on the importance of having health and wellness services located in the community and the importance of maintaining a full spectrum of services at the community level. Mental health was identified as a community priority that lacked some resources, and there were some calls to make some improvements in that area. But really overall, the long-term viability of the community was linked to the town's population and maintaining these services over time. And the town was also seeing some changing population demographics, which was also a factor that would influence community planning and priorities in the near future, with important impacts for infrastructure, like maintaining the school and the hospital and supporting local businesses. So I think, when we start to see sometimes these unintended policy effects of the just transition, we really need to look at what does this look like at a community level, and how are those who are maybe not directly employed in the sector, how are they also experiencing these effects and these unintended consequences of some of these policy decisions. And so part of our work was doing a social resilience audit in collaboration with the community. And a number of service providers said that a resilient community is a community that continues to grow, that's able to face adversity and challenges in the community, that can attract the people that are needed for good healthcare, infrastructure, to make them resilient and keep them in the community, and able to grow and thrive and not suffer through adversity. So this idea of being able to weather the storm and working together, that's adaptable, to change, that's both positive and negative, but also has resources to help manage and adapt with the change. And so many participants said that the town of Hannah had many services to offer for a small town. They expressed a great appreciation for the availability of those services in the community, but also saw, at the same time, that the economic downturn that was experienced, particularly at the start of the COVID pandemic, kind of what those effects have looked like, people experiencing adverse life experiences and needing to be able to access services with new demands being experienced in those areas. So I hope that adds to the conversation in terms of thinking about, there are sometimes unintended consequences, and how do we adapt and cope with these changes as they're happening. One of the participants said that a resilient community meant that a resilient community aims to build relationships and to connect people and ideas to come together. Resilience is about building a stronger community to gain confidence and to foster hope. A resilient community has leadership that reflects a hopefulness and positive outlook in looking for new opportunities in light of the coal transition. I know resilience can be a contested concept, but I think as we think about just transitions, and this is something that is being experienced in Alberta today, and will continue to be experienced as we move towards moving off of coal by 2030. So I think it's important that we listen to affected community members directly in the sector, but also those outside who may be also indirectly affected by these policy shifts and changes.
That was so much and so good. Thank you for sharing that. Sarah, can you ask the question one more time? Sorry.
Absolutely, yeah. It's basically asking panelists to talk about how specific groups of people, and I think in my mind that meant people who've been kind of historically and currently excluded or marginalized, will be impacted if just energy transitions are not prioritized. And in other words, what happens if we just replace our current energy sources and do nothing else? If we're just moving sources, but not changing anything else around them.
I think that gap is just going to continue getting bigger, greater, with Indigenous people and the movement. I see it getting larger. I don't know if anybody has ever really visited or spent a lot of time in Indigenous communities here on the panel, but we have a housing crisis. We have an educational crisis. We have old buildings that need to be upgraded. We have healthcare crisis, and most points we have an opioid crisis. There's a lot of crisis that we're living within. So this climate crisis is just another part of the circle that was kind of created when we were put into these areas. And so there's a lot of things happening. And so I see this kind of just getting, I see Indigenous people being left behind in that. And, I see just things business as usual. I think there would be some people that would be happy about that, but I do think that there would be a lot of issues and the gap would get bigger and it would be harder. And when 50 years from now, we'd still be having this conversation and it would be just another day in Canada, but within, Indigenous communities, we'd be fighting for our very existence and trying to be a part of those conversations. So I'm gonna leave it there, but I think it's important to support and offer support.
Yes, thank you so much, Jacob. And Jen and Julie, I think, just really hearing about folks who maybe haven't had access to resources, justice in the first place. And if we don't put that at the heart, that will just continue to grow. I also appreciate, Julie, what you were saying about the kind of, when we talk about transition, sometimes we talk just about the workers and we don't talk about kind of the community around them and the other people within that community. So I think, thank you for sharing. I feel like there's a lot to think about here. And I guess I wanted to ask a question, and I might, Jacob, keep you on the spot if that's okay. Because I think we've done, obviously there's so much more we could talk about in terms of painting the picture of what is a just energy transition? What does that look like? What happens if we don't do it? But I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts, just to kind of bring it to maybe the folks in the audience here about how people can kind of get involved. And then we'll move into our audience questions. But I just wanted to know if you had any kind of initial thoughts about if there is one thing you think people could kind of step into in terms of supporting just energy transitions, what would that be? So maybe Jacob, because you spoke to grassroots kind of action and engagement, I'll maybe leave you on the spot if that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's really important to get involved and support Indigenous-led climate justice groups, climate action groups, grassroots movements. If you aren't able to go and volunteer your time, connect them with resources, connect them with partnerships, connect them with people that are willing to support them so that they can continue to build capacity, because I guarantee you, them just building capacity is making a positive impact within Indigenous spaces and communities, as well as supporting the projects that they're going to implement within those Indigenous communities and nations, right? So if $1 comes to Indigenous climate action, Indigenous climate action takes half of the dollar to ensure that it goes to community, but the other half goes towards supporting and building capacity within the organization, right? And so it's Indigenous people helping Indigenous people, utilizing outside investment. And so I think that's kind of something that, it's been working for ICA. Now, again, don't quote me. I don't know if it's 50-50, okay? Like that, it might even be 90% goes to the community and 10% goes towards, I don't know what that structure is because I'm not in operations, I'm in engagement now. But, just ensuring that folks on the ground can have access to those resources. That was a conversation even at the United Nations level, is ensuring that if there is financing for climate justice and climate action, how much of that dollar is going towards the actual people on the ground or the Indigenous organizations, nations, and communities, and that it's not just an outside company coming in saying, we have the solutions to help you, so we're going to divert the money that's supposed to go to these Indigenous communities over here, and then 10 cents goes to this project, and then the rest of it stays out here. So I've seen that happen. It's not very pretty and not very nice when that happens, but I've seen that where it's like it's going, bam, it gets diverted because of network, power, privilege, understanding that, hey, I know somebody that's a part of that. Let's do this because we can't allow Indigenous people to have autonomy over their dollar. That's supposed to be going towards that. So ensuring that the dollar does hit the ground, and I think the best way to do that is ensuring that Indigenous people have access and are able to decide on how that money is spent.
Yeah, there's definitely a massive conversation to be had about funding and who directly can access that money. So thank you for bringing that up. Jen or Julie, do you have anything you'd like to add to this question? And the question is, how can people get involved? So just to read it.
This may be a little bit naive and overly simplistic, but writing politicians and raising it as an issue that is that our governments need to address. I think like Jacob makes a really important point about the importance of grassroots organizations in society and in changing how we think about what's valuable and again, like how we think about specific issues. But I also think that we can push on the other end within our institutions to help our politicians know that this is important to us as individuals and important to us as part of society.
Sure, I'd like to add. So I think, climate action is so important, and there's many ways that, individuals and groups can get engaged in this work. I think part of it is building awareness and building capacity in this area to take action. I know within the field of social work, this is something that we're developing more capacity in a Canadian context to be incorporating environmental justice and sustainability in our work. I'm involved in a BSW redesign process that is significantly changing how we deliver social work education, and it includes some principles around equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization that's going to be integrated across all of our courses. And I think having these kinds of critical conversations and dialogues, bringing together diverse views and experiences, to learn from one another and exchange, and identifying what's happening in communities from the perspective of community members, and recognizing that people are situated in very different ways, and these changes that we're experiencing are not going to be experienced in the same way by individuals. And so trying to better understand that and learn from one another, and co-developing like these solutions or ways of thinking about these issues. And again, that importance of building relationships, I think is very critical in this work.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I guess maybe what I'll do, I'm just noticing we're almost at 1:30, so I might invite Alana Dawn to share some of what she's seeing in the question and answer box. So Alana Dawn, feel free to pop in with some of the questions for the panel.
For sure, we have some great questions coming in. So the first one, I might ask you to speak to first, Julie, because it's related to the coal phase out. So with the coal phase out by 2030 and the formation of Just Transition Task Force, I'm guessing that's like the Canadian Just Transition Task Force, what would you recommend as a policy solution to help impacted communities transition away from coal?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think one of the things that we've learned from our work with Hannah Learning Center, who led this initiative, is that there is a need for long-term support. So, and we see this also in the literature in other countries that have undergone some of these transitions. For example, in Germany, we're not talking about projects that are funded for 1, 2, or 3 years. It sometimes takes decades, right, to really support and look at how do we skill and transition and diversify economies so that they're managing these changes and really looking towards the future. And so I think one policy solution is to take a longer term approach and recognize that there are these unintended consequences and impacts, and there's a need to better understand those, and that a just transition is important to consider for workers, but also the families of those workers and the service providers in those communities who are seeing increased mental health impacts, increase in domestic violence rates, increase in substance uses, and really thinking about how do we address, again, these kind of interconnected crises in new ways and supporting this in the long term, throughout this transition.
I think I'll just quickly jump in that part of part of responding to these crises and these policy imperatives is thinking about not just I would say like the intersectionality of the effects of a given policy in combination with all of the other effects that community is facing, but also thinking about the interactions of a given policy choice like a coal phase out with all the other climate mitigation and adaptation policies in place and what's proposed, so that there's a comprehensive picture of the consequences. And so and part of that exercise is, I think, to try and avoid some of the unintended consequences that Julie mentioned. If there's a more comprehensive assessment of policy interactions and like policy interactions from the top-down perspective, and then the effects in communities of everything that's happening at once from a bottom-up perspective.
Thanks. Jacob, did you want to add anything around policy solutions to help impacted communities transition away from coal?
Yeah, it all depends. It all depends. My partner's from the Navajo Nation, and they just closed their last coal mine power their plant. They just closed it. It was outside of Page, Arizona, where the Grand Canyon is, and so I think one of the issues is ensuring that they have those proper supports, systems in place in the policy, so that it's not, we're going to close this power plant and then all of a sudden we got to go react now to closing the power plant because the town is people are leaving, and it's causing a lot of economic turmoil within the town. So it's being proactive. Okay, we're going to close out by this. What are the steps that we need to take in order to meet that goal? And what are the new jobs? What are the new careers that we're forging? And what are the training and development? And how are we bringing everybody into that decision-making table on what that future looks like? And I think where I kind of come at it a little bit is that Indigenous perspective of ensuring that, okay, we're going to close this power plant, but we need we need resources. We need support to ensure that these workers have a career to go into that is not, mining coal. It's going to be, maybe it's, working on, PVs, solar panels and whatnot. And what does the infrastructure look like to build that project out? And what's the training and development? And do these folks need education for schools, extra schooling? And what about childcare? What if there's a single mother that is working here and now she has to transition over here? What does that support mechanism look like? And so just making sure that we're not forgetting about, folks that are single parents or, that are young parents, young families that don't have the proper, supports. And in Calgary, I think, the cost of lettuce was $10. Like, I can't believe that, inflation. So keeping that in mind as we transition over so that folks have the proper support. Anyways, that's my 2 cents.
Thanks so much, everyone. Our next question from the audience is, and it's a two-part one, but there's been talks about a Just Transition Act since 2019, but the government has been reticent regarding the status of this legislation. So their question is, what are some of the reasons for the lack of an act to date? And then part two is, what would legislation of a just transition principles accomplish? Jennifer.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm the one that caved to the awkward silence first. That is a great question, and it's a tough question. I think some of this, the ideas behind a just transition are present in not necessarily legislation, but in policy actions and strategies. So for example, I think of the BC's Clean BC plan, and that explicitly says that BC wants to reduce emissions, change energy systems, and do it without leaving anyone behind. I think and so there are those sorts of goals inherent in, I would say, like a lot of policy actions in, like, NRCan is working on just transitions, and they're calling it a people-centered just transition principles. But I think part of the challenge is, again, this tension between federal and provincial and territorial responsibility, in that it's in many ways it's provinces that are responsible for implementing the just transition, not just in the change in energy systems, but overseeing labor markets. And so that creates I would say, like, a challenge of agreeing on what a just transition looks like for all of Canada versus the individual circumstances in each province and territory, and even in the individual circumstances in different communities. Like, a just transition in Calgary looks very different from a just transition in Tuktoyaktuk, for example, because of the different circumstances and challenges that different communities face. Tuktoyaktuk has the potential to be absorbed by the ocean without significant investment in infrastructure isn't quite the right word, but infrastructure to protect the land, versus Calgary, where we more worry about flooding events and things like that. So I think this is not meant to be a hand wavy answer, but I think part of it is what a just transition means is not universal across communities or provinces and territories in Canada, and that makes it really hard to have some sort of blanket legislated policy direction, where when we think about just transition, it's really about the experiences of people, and that's much more micro level a policy development.
Is anyone else feeling like they want to jump in on this question, or we have a couple others we could? Oh, okay. Let's see, Jacob.
Politicians are going to be politicians, in my opinion. I spoke to one when I was at COP, and he gave me the most politician answer ever. We can't do anything because we want to set the example. And I'm like, what does that even mean? What does that even mean? And you're the guy that's doing, I can't say his name because I don't want to bash him, but I'm sure he had good intentions to why he answered it like that. But I'm just like, what? So I do question, I think that's one of the reasons why. And I think it's just, not coming to a consensus on what that's going to look like. So I know that's not really an answer to the first one, but, what would legislation of just transition principles accomplish? Well, I think we'd get the ball rolling for sure. I think that would help, with drafting a budget on what that's going to look like and how those dollars are going to go out into communities across so-called Canada. And then we can start to develop, different frameworks there on how things are going to be moved around and whatnot. So I think principles are really good, and I think we need to start being a little bit more proactive. But yeah, again, like, we're not going to get there if people are like, well, let's not do anything. Let's go ahead and set the example of not doing anything for the next people to come in and not do anything. So anyway.
Julie, did you have anything to add before we move on, or?
Yeah, I would say, it is something that's being, people are waiting for this, in terms of thinking about a Just Transition Act and what this might look like. Consultations have taken place. The federal government has said it's committed to doing this, to support livelihoods of workers and their communities and moving towards a low carbon global economy. However, what is this going to look like? There's complications. I don't know. It's sort of a wait and see, I think, at this point, when this might actually come about.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Our next question is, how do we finance a just transition? So this represents an expensive and lengthy process that will incur costs while losing historical sources of revenue. So any thoughts on how we finance a just transition?
Okay, I will jump in again. I think I'll link it to the last question of, what would legislation of just transition principles accomplish? And then, that immediately speaks of, okay, so if we have like principles in place that were all notionally agreed upon, then that I think places constraints on both say government policymaking in terms of what's feasible, and it also means that given principles, say like in the Clean BC example of leaving no one behind, that in my mind comes together with dollar signs of investments in ensuring that no one is left behind, and so when we're thinking about a just transition and financing it, it is a societal goal, I would say. And that means I think in many ways, it's incumbent on governments, and that could be at multiple levels, or it could be federal governments. There's no federal government, sorry, the federal government financing many of these changes, and then it's like, well, and then it's really a question of how do governments finance any policy like healthcare or education? It's through taxes or through borrowing, and then it's the question really becomes of, are we willing to sacrifice other things, like we as a society, to finance this just transition, or are we willing to bear higher taxes either now or in the future to get to meet these objectives that we have? So I don't think in many ways it's a much simpler problem than I would say, like, defining what a just transition is and what the objectives are. It's just like, okay, if we have an objective, what are we willing to trade off to meet those objectives relative to all the other constraints faced by governments?
I think how to pay for it is to figure out, well, what is causing the root of this, right? What is causing the root of this, and figure out a way to separate that. So, you know, if that means upping taxes, or upping taxes now or upping taxes later, um, honestly, I think it should be something done sooner rather than later, because we are in a crisis. But again, that doesn't mean that we go ahead and bulldoze everybody and we start, you know, let's just tax everybody. Like, we have to figure that out. But I think the government would step in to ensure that they are ensuring that nobody's left behind, as well as corporations and the private sector, because I do believe that they had something to do with this and that they should be taxed as well. They should be paying into this. So if it was a pie and it was cut up into three, that private sector and would be paying for some of this, and then government, and then the people, so that everybody is sharing that weight, because you do have a sector that has profited heavily off of this, and now they're trying to pass the puck. No. I think that they should be responsible as well, because we're paying for that. So
maybe I can add, I think this is a really big issue, and I would say internationally, you know, we've seen here at the COP conference that, you know, just within the last few days, you know, a lot of discussions on climate financing, and what does this mean in terms of how, what is the role of finance and resource in the loss and damage conversation that's taken place internationally. And so, you know, how is financing going to be provided to countries in the global south who are being impacted by different types of climate disasters, and what kind of funding will be available to support some of the work that needs to take place to kind of build back with resilience and address some of these changes. And so, you know, I think the question maybe was, you know, the questions about how do we finance a just transition. I think we need to look at that within our Canadian context, but we also need to look at this internationally as well. And I'd say this is something that is still being debated and discussed in terms of like what this looks like, where are these funds coming from, what's needed, and who's going to have access to these resources, and really thinking about, I think, some new funding arrangements, having dedicated funds available. You know, this has emerged around the loss and damages, and at COP, and you know, more work is going to be done in this area.
Okay, thanks. We have another question here, and we've also been getting lots of thanks in the questions too. So everyone's really enjoying the great conversation. So thank you, panelists. So they're curious to know if consumerism has also been part of the conversation around climate justice, and, you know, what does this look like?
I'd be happy to start. I think very much so. I think there's a recognition that our consumerist culture, and I would say greater capitalism, has contributed to the exploitation of the Earth's resources, and that we need to rethink how our fundamental systems and structures are operating, how our global economies are functioning with this extractive-based approach. And Naomi Klein talks about this in some of her work about how capitalism is fueling climate injustices around the world. And that would be a reading that I would recommend if people are interested in learning more about some of these linkages and connections.
just to double down on that, I absolutely think that consumerism is definitely leading to climate change. And again, going back to that story, is reconnecting is climate justice, climate action within your Indigenous heritage and ancestry, and becoming more involved in that way of life, that traditional way of life of not wanting more than you need. And so it's living within your means, but it's also, we used to live a life where we didn't have trash, and if there was a piece of the animal that we didn't want, it was biodegradable. It would go back to the earth, or another animal would come and it would serve its purpose, right? And so it's going back to that way of like not buying all the shirts in the store, not needing all this stuff, like not accumulating all this junk in our houses, because that's not really how we used to be. Well, at least for some, I'm speaking from an Indigenous perspective again. Like, I don't think we really had all that much in our teepees and our hogans and our longhouses. It was different. It was a completely different way of life that we've kind of been pushed away from, and it's just we're participating in this economy that's based in extractivism and capitalism and consumerism. And so I think it's going back to those traditional ways of life where it's simpler is better, but also like being who we are. And so that right there, if you just went from here to here, you would fight climate change. You would get away from that. You'd stop participating in that economy. But it's really hard to do that because, capitalism is so good at marketing. They're so good at marketing that house, that green yard, being able to turn on the water and water that yard and have that white picket fence and have, the big truck and have the other two cars, and you want to go on 10 vacations a year because that's the goal. It's so good at selling that lifestyle, that dream. And I think that's part of the issue, right? Is that dream is built upon something that doesn't exist anymore, and I don't think it ever exists. I think it was something that they tried to sell you on so that you can participate down that rabbit hole. And I think we're starting to realize that going that direction is actually, it's slowly hurting the earth, and we're at a point now that we're at a tipping point that we can't keep going down that way. And so I think really, going back to this conversation, listening to Indigenous people, because our Indigenous rights, that is the solution to climate change. Like it's pretty straightforward. Sorry, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer.
So I like I like my life. I recognize that I have an incredibly privileged life. I do think we are not very good at, we as a society, and most of Canada, we are not very good at preventing wastefulness. And I think it's because we value the environment as an abstract, in that it's nice that it's there and it's nice to visit Banff National Park and things like that, but we frequently don't appreciate the cost, or we don't have a good sense of the cost of our actions on the environment. And so I would say that part of our challenge is being better informed as to the consequences of our actions. And I would say, for example, like the embodied emissions. So like the emissions in, say, my notebook, right, is not just the cost of, like, the gasoline in my car to go and buy a notebook or anything like that. It's the emissions from production of that notebook. And I have no idea how bad those are. And so part of it is we we don't have, I would say, a holistic sense of the consequences of our choices, and that makes and that makes making informed choices about whether or not it's whether or not it's a good idea for the planet to buy bananas and things like that, where they're imported from warmer countries. And so I think in many ways, saying consumerism is the problem is insufficient. It's being, I would say, like ill-informed and not wanting to inform ourselves about the consequences of our choices is leading to is leading to these suboptimal outcomes for society and for the planet.
Just to kind of tag along with that, I think too, as we come up with solutions and ensuring that everybody is involved in that process, that it's not like, it's really, how do I say this? Like, this is going to sound really far out there, but there's two kinds of solutions. There are ones that are built and formulated in capitalism, where it's an opportunity, we're going to gain so much money and da 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 da, and that's like, that seems to be the only winning solution. But sometimes the solution isn't sexy. It isn't based in capitalism. It isn't, so we can't really like only focus on one, and that seems to be one of the issues that we're facing, because the folks that are coming up with these so-called solutions are excluding a lot of people, and they're not thinking about those folks that are experiencing climate change, like right now, like what's happening right now with the water, with villages sinking into the sea, all that kind of stuff. Like, they're thinking, what are the profits? What can we do to spin this so that we can make an opportunity for ourselves, so that we can get rich, but we'll sell it to the world at a fraction of the cost. But all that fraction adds up to percentages, So I think it's really understanding that, like, there are solutions that are based in the earth of this land, and there are solutions that are based in concrete. And so we have to be very understanding and aware of that. And so that's why, again, I look to Indigenous people, because they've lived in this world for thousands of years, and especially here in Turtle Island. But for the last couple hundred years, this society that we've created, or that so-called Americans, whatever colonialism has created, we're in a climate crisis right now. So I really just want folks to understand that, is look at that, and how do you compare and contrast that, and what is the best way to move forward, so that we're not buying into false solutions, is what I'm saying. So anyway.
I just want to add one more thing, and then I think Alana Dawn is going to wrap us up. But I really appreciate that kind of, like, Jacob, you've really summarized, I think, that kind of going back to, like, what is a just transition? What does it require from us? And that kind of, like, paradigm shift of how we actually think about, and I say we as, like, somebody who's non-Indigenous, how we think about the earth and the land, and, like, kind of having our leaders also thinking in a different way about, about moving forward. So I really appreciate it. I think your comments just really kind of brought us to a really important place in terms of what we, where we're headed in terms of our solutions. So thank you for laying that out. And I just wanted to say thank you so much to all three of you. I've learned so much from you in this session. And yeah, maybe I'll just pass it over to Alana Dawn to wrap us up.
For sure. We have like 2 minutes. Julie, I noticed you unmuted yourself. Did you have like one quick thing you wanted to say?
Sure. Well, I was just going to mention the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that I think are an important foundation for us to, continue to build awareness and take action on. One of the goals is related to climate action, but another goal, since we're talking about consumption, is Goal 12, responsible consumption and production, right? And in that goal, looking at the unsustainable patterns of consumption and production, which are contributing as root causes to climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So I just wanted to raise that. I think the 17 SDGs is an important area for us to build our awareness on, and also think about, you know, these interconnections that exist as we think about just transition, and then how do we also advance sustainability through these goals. And we think about that in Alberta, because we actually don't have a lot of conversation taking place, I think, on the SDGs in our province.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll add, I think it's the number 17 that's like around partnership too. And I know we talked a lot about today around like relationships and partnerships and how we can really do this together to have just energy transition. We grappled with a lot of big questions today. I really appreciate everyone's sharing your expertise and your knowledge. Thank you so much for being with us today. And yeah, I will thank you, Sarah, for moderating. And it was just really lovely to learn from you also. Thank you so much. And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.